Hey everyone, welcome to our coverage of the 2020 election. We are going to talk today about San Francisco local measures. So I hope you're excited to dive into what's happening locally in your community. We're going to allow a few minutes for other folks to join the webinar. So we'll get started at about 12:05. Hey, if you're just joining us, you are on TechEquity's 2020 election coverage webinar, What's on the Ballot for San Francisco. We're going to allow until 12:05 for late arrivals, and then we'll go ahead and jump in. So just hang tight and we'll get started shortly. Okay, it is 12:05, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining us for TechEquity's election series. We're hosting a ton of events to make sure that you know everything that you need to feel confident in casting your vote this November. And today we're going to be covering San Francisco's local measures. So I hope that you have a pen and paper handy and you're ready to jot down all of your positions to make voting easy for yourself once your ballot comes in the mail. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump right in. And I want to first kick things off by introducing my colleague, TechEquity's policy manager, Annie Perry, who will be giving us the down low on most of what we need to know today.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited to fill you in on all of the 12 ballot measures in San Francisco this year.
Awesome. So as Herman said in the chat, we will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, and we'll leave plenty of time to dig in to those. It would be helpful if you can drop your questions into the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. We'll use the chat just for saying hello to each other in discourse, but questions should go into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to drop your questions in throughout the webinar. We're going to be going through a lot of different measures, and we don't want you to forget your question by the time we get to the Q&A section, so feel free to drop those in as we go along. I want to start first before we jump into the measures by talking a little bit about TechEquity for those of you who are new to our organization. We created TechEquity to be a place for tech workers to come and learn more about the challenges that are facing our communities, and to understand what kind of impactful ways they can engage and contribute to solutions in partnership with the broader community. And so our goal is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing, and we remain optimistic about the tech industry's potential to drive broad-based economic growth that's accessible to everyone. But it's clear to us that we need the participation and allyship of tech workers like you all on this webinar in order to make that vision a reality. And building a more equitable tech-driven economy is going to require some changes. And these go beyond decisions that one company or one individual makes, although the decisions that companies and individuals make are important. What we really need is bold, comprehensive policy change that will be necessary to ensure opportunity and prosperity for everyone, and that our industry can benefit the entire community. And so that's why TechEquity works on advancing initiatives in both housing and workforce and labor policy. We see these two areas as really holding the key to moving towards an equitable tech-driven economy. And these issues are really closely linked. We can't advance one without the other. Where you're able to afford to live helps to determine what kind of jobs you're able to have access to. It'll be really hard for you to hold down a job in San Francisco at a tech company if you live all the way out in Modesto. And likewise, what kind of job you have determines where you're able to afford to live. So we see these issues as being really intertwined, and we advance policy platforms on both of these areas. Today, we're going to focus first on the measures that are on the ballot that relate back to these issue areas, because that's the expertise that Annie and I have. But we'll also give some summaries of the other measures that are on the ballot in San Francisco that don't have to do with housing or workforce and labor issues, so that you're prepared to cast your ballot on everything that's happening locally. In order to advance these policy platforms on housing and workforce and labor, we help tech workers approach these problems and engage in the system in three major ways. The first is to educate folks about the most critical civic issues where you live. This webinar is a great example of that, right? Casting your ballot and feeling prepared and informed to do so is one way that we can help to educate tech workers about the issues. The second is that we activate you on a policy agenda that results in a more inclusive economy in our communities. And if you're interested in getting involved with any of our campaigns, we have a regular weekly phone bank that we host for Prop 15. And so if you want to advocate and you want to take it a step further beyond voting, Herman will drop a link in the chat where you can get involved with that. And we also connect you on a personal level to the community where you live and the people who live there, sort of outside of our own bubble, to feel connected to everyone else in the community, especially those that are feeling the pain of our affordability crisis the most. And the great news is that we've had a lot of impact over the last 3 years. We've been building a network of tech workers excited to learn more about the issues facing our communities, who are eager to engage. And we've done a lot. I'll just focus on one of the things from this photo collage. In the upper left, we have our governor signing into law a bill that TechEquity co-sponsored last year that provided tenant protections to more renters than any other bill in US history. So that was a pretty proud moment for us, and tech workers were part of a broad coalition with tenant organizations to move that bill through the process and into law. So again, we'd love to have you involved beyond voting to engage in our advocacy programs, to educate yourself further. With that, we're going to jump into the main program, which is what you all came for, the 2020 election. Before we get into the measures themselves, I think it's really important that we all think about how we're going to vote this year, since it's really different than previous years, but also not that different. A lot of Californians for years have already been casting their ballots in the mail. And so this is not that different for California from how we do things usually, but might be different for how you've done things in the past. Before you go to vote, you want to make sure that your voter registration is up to date, that you're registered at your current address so that you receive your ballot in the mail. And you can go to vote.org in order to check your voter registration and make sure that it's current and correct. The second thing that you're going to want to do is figure out your positions on all of the things that are on the ballot. We've got dozens of measures to consider, as well as candidates. So doing a little bit of homework in advance, like this webinar that you're attending, will help you to make sure that that process goes smoothly. You're going to be voting on things other than San Francisco local measures, including a bunch of statewide props. So you can consult TechEquity's voter guide, which will be released next week, to make sure that you get the download on all of those measures. And if you're not yet signed up for the newsletter, we'll drop a link in the chat where you can sign up to make sure you get that voter guide directly in your inbox. The next thing I should mention for voting this year is that you should vote by mail if you can, and vote early. There's going to be a lot of mail-in ballots coming in, and so the earlier that you can send back your ballot, the smoother that process is going to go. But if you don't get your ballot in time, you have options. Don't be concerned. Make sure that you look up your designated polling place, and you can drop off your mail-in ballot at any polling place within your county where you vote. And also there's ballot drop boxes all over the Bay Area that you can drop your ballot off as well. So if you don't get it in the mail in time, it's not the end of the world. You can still get your ballot in through other channels. Every registered voter will receive a ballot in the mail, and polling places and early voting will be open in most counties in California. If you do prefer to vote at the polls, polling places will need to meet physical distancing guidelines. But if you are concerned about that, sending in an absentee ballot where you vote by mail is another easy way for you to get your vote in. You also want to make sure that your vote counts. So voting early is important. You do have some time after Election Day if you mail in your ballot. It just needs to be postmarked by Election Day in California. But voting earlier will ensure that your ballot makes it in on time. Drop your ballot off if you're concerned that mailing it will not make it into the polls in time. And you can also track your ballot in California, which is really exciting. California has a site that's california.ballottracks.net/voter. And you can actually see where your ballot is in the process as you submit it to the mail and it goes through to getting counted. There's also a little perforated tear sheet on your vote by mail ballots that gives you a little serial number, and you can hang on to that as a receipt to be able to track your ballot and know that your vote will be counted. The final thing I want to mention on voting best practices is that you should try to triple your vote. And what I mean by that is to make sure that you are bringing friends, family members, and roommates to the polls with you. So don't just keep this information that you learned today to yourself. go and commit to talking to 3 of your friends after this webinar, talk to them about what you learned about the San Francisco measures, and encourage them to vote as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ian Eve, our election and policy expert here, to talk about some things to keep in mind when we're voting and to jump into the San Francisco measures.
Thanks a lot, Megan. So when you're looking at your ballot and you're looking at all of the ballot measures that are on it, both statewide and in your county, there's a few things that are helpful to keep in mind that apply basically to any ballot measure. So usually, most ballot measures will pass if they receive a majority of the vote. This isn't the case for some individual measures, and actually there's a few like this on the ballot in San Francisco, which I'll mention, that require more than a majority to pass. But generally speaking, 50% of the vote plus 1 wins. It's also important to know that when laws get changed through the ballot, it's a little different than when the legislature passes a law, because it's a lot harder to change that law subsequently. A lot of times when something's passed by a ballot measure, it takes another ballot measure to make changes to the law. And so it's important just to remember that, things that might be that might feel like smaller issues with a measure can carry a different weight when it's on a ballot measure versus a piece of legislation, because it's harder to tweak that down the road if it does turn out to cause any problems. And part of that kind of question about the difference between regular legislation and ballot measures is this idea of asking yourself, should this be on the ballot? Is this something that needs to go to the voters to be decided, or would it be better off for the legislature to take this on themselves? And part of that is just that reason that I mentioned before, that it's easier to make changes if some unintended consequences arise down the road. And then last but not least, it's helpful to take a look at who placed a measure on the ballot. Generally in California, there's 2 main ways to put something on the ballot. The legislature can vote to have a ballot measure go to the voters, and then voters themselves can sign petitions. And if they gather a certain amount, that measure gets put on the ballot. That's a mix. When ballots get put on the sent to the voters that way, it's a mix between measures that come from kind of more grassroots sources, and we'll also see that there are times when more special interest type groups are the ones driving those campaigns. And it's helpful to know the backstory there, and we'll share some of that with you today. So with those tips in mind, why don't we move on to the San Francisco measures? Here's just a quick overview. There's 12 of them, which is a lot. So we're gonna, as Megan said, we're gonna go through first the ones that we're taking positions on. And as a reminder, we take positions on measures that have a close connection to our issue areas, which are housing and workforce and labor. And then after we go through the ones that we're taking positions on, I'm going to run through the rest of them on the at the end, just so you have some more information about everything that you're voting on next month. So to get us started, Measure A in San Francisco. This is a bond that would pay for homelessness services and housing for our unhoused neighbors, as well as maintenance for parks and streets and sidewalks. So if Measure A gets passed, and Measure A is one of these actually that requires a higher threshold. So this needs 2/3 of the vote in order to succeed. San Francisco would borrow $487 million and then pay that back with interest over 30 years. And like I said, the money that is borrowed is going to be used for housing for our unhoused neighbors, also some services for them, and maintenance on parks and street infrastructure.
Well, thanks for providing a high-level summary of the measure. I think one of the things that I wondered when I first found out about this measure is to really dive into the difference between a bond and a tax. Both of these are ways for us to raise money, but what's the difference, and is one better than the other?
So the difference is a bond is borrowing money upfront, which then gets paid back over time with interest with tax revenue, whereas a tax is a direct, payment from taxpayers to whichever government is imposing that tax. In terms of like which is better, it depends. It depends on kind of what the money is being used for, how much is being borrowed, the terms of like borrowing or the terms of the tax. So there isn't necessarily a hard and fast rule for that. We generally think though for some of the uses that Measure A is putting money towards, it would be better probably in the long term if there was a more sustainable funding stream, something like tax revenue. But we also know that because of a lot of restrictions in California on the ability of local governments to pass tax increases, that option isn't always on the table. And that's actually why we're heavily supporting Prop 15, which is a state measure that would bring $11.5 billion a year back to local schools and communities by getting rid of a corporate tax break.
Right.
In the meantime, though, we think that these are extremely pressing problems facing San Francisco, and so a bond is maybe not our first choice of how to address this problem, but still is worthy of your vote.
Got it. So it sounds like local governments are having to do a little bit of a piecemeal solution because we have some systemic issues on a state level that are preventing us from getting the funding that we need. Yep. Like Prop 15 works to address this issue on the state level by getting some new tax revenue that could be filtered down to the local level. And speaking of that piecemeal kind of patchwork of solutions that cities have tried to implement, I recall that in 2018, last election, we raised money for homelessness through Prop C. So it feels like we're doing a similar thing to what we did 2 years ago. Can you talk about how Measure A and Prop C are a little bit different and why we need both of those things?
Yeah, so Prop C from 2018 is a tax on businesses in San Francisco. And so that does provide a sustainable source of funding for these services and housing. But the scale of this problem is so large that the city needs additional funding to keep putting these programs in place and keep creating housing for folks. So that's part of why they're coming back with Measure A this year. It's also important to note that Measure A uses some of the money on things that aren't included in Prop C, like parks and street infrastructure.
Got it. So it's not just providing services directly to people who are experiencing homelessness. It's also the kind of infrastructure and maintenance, like parks that are utilized heavily for homeless folks who don't have anywhere else to go. And we need additional funds to support them at the parks and make sure the parks stay clean and safe.
Yep, and there's also actually, unfortunately, in San Francisco, like a several $100 million maintenance backlog for both parks and streets. And so that's just general safety issues for all users of both parks and streets and sidewalks, which is probably most people. And so this is a way, again, for the city to raise some extra money to take care of some of those needs.
Great. Well, as I said at the top of the webinar, we're going to take questions at the end, but if you have questions about Measure A, you can go ahead and drop them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen now, and we'll take those at the end of the webinar. So moving on to Measure F, will you give us the background on this one, Amy?
Sure. So Measure F will restructure the way that businesses are taxed in San Francisco. And it does it in a way that both lowers taxes for small businesses while raising them for medium and large-sized businesses, and overall bringing in about $97 million more in tax revenue to San Francisco every year. This is important because San Francisco is facing a large budget deficit as a result of the pandemic, so the extra revenue helps fill in that hole. The tax cut for small businesses also kind of helps support their growth in the city and make the distribution of taxation a little bit more fair. We should also mention, though, that this measure takes into account the effects of the pandemic and actually slows down any tax increases for businesses who've lost a significant portion of their revenue because of the pandemic. A couple other things that are important in this measure is that it backstops funding for an early childhood education program that was passed also in 2018, but was subject to a lawsuit that was holding up some of the funding for that program. So what Measure F does is it says if ultimately a court strikes down that measure and eliminates the funding for that early childhood education program, Measure F would kick in and provide backup funding for it.
Gotcha. So one of the questions that a lot of people I'm sure have on their minds is that the pandemic is hitting business hard, particularly hitting small businesses hard, and a lot of jobs are being eliminated. So is now really the time to change up the tax structure in San Francisco? What's the response to that?
I mean, that's a great question, and something that people should be concerned about. This tax for everybody phases in over 3 years from 2021 to 2024. And like I mentioned, for businesses that have really been hit hard by the pandemic, it slows down any increases they have to pay even more. And then also it provides a tax cut for small businesses who might be particularly vulnerable to the effects of the recession caused by the pandemic.
Makes sense. Again, if you have questions about Measure F, please drop those into the Q&A function and we'll circle back to it at the end of the webinar. Moving right along at a clip here to Measure I, give us the summary.
Cool. Oh, I should also say on Measure F, I forgot to do this, even though it's on the slide, we support Measure F and recommend a yes vote.
Yes.
Okay, so Measure I, another tax. This one is a tax on real estate sales, both for commercial and residential property. And so this one increases the rates on sales of properties that are worth more than $10 million. So properties that are worth between 10 and $25 million see the tax rate on their sales go from 2.75% to 5.75%. And properties worth $25 million or more get doubled from 3 to 6%. So a couple things to know about that tax revenue. On average, it's expected to raise about $196 million annually, but that's going to be very volatile because we're talking about kind of like these very big transactions going through, and one really big transaction can dramatically change the amount of tax revenue collected in a given year. So while this is expected kind of on average to get about $200 million a year, some years that might be a lot higher, some years that might be a lot lower. Another thing to know about this one is the money is just going into what's known as the city's general fund, which means that there aren't firm restrictions on how it can be spent. But the Board of Supervisors passed a non-binding resolution in addition to this, putting this measure on the ballot, that would commit the revenue raised by Measure I to next year funding rental assistance to prevent evictions related to the pandemic, and then also put money into a fund to build publicly owned affordable housing in San Francisco.
Gotcha. Well, one of the things that comes to mind for me about this measure is that this transfer tax only affects more expensive properties, and the threshold for this tax kicking in starts at properties that are sold at $10 million and above. And granted, houses are expensive in San Francisco, but $10 million is a pretty fancy house. Yeah. So why is this threshold so high? We've seen other cities pass thresholds that start at different rates. Berkeley did one in the last election cycle, as did Oakland. So what's the deal with the variation of who gets taxed and why?
Totally. So I should mention this threshold question is kind of a source of some controversy over Measure I. So in other Bay Area cities that have done transfer taxes, that higher tax rate has kicked in at a lower property value. In many cities, it's been around $2 million or more. The San Francisco plan only kicks in at $10 million. And the increase in the tax rate in the San Francisco plan is larger than some of the increases in the tax rates in other cities. And so basically, San Francisco is imposing a tax increase on a smaller set of properties that are worth more money and increasing the taxes on them more. When we're talking about what kind of properties are going to get hit by this tax, like Megan was saying, even in San Francisco, a $10 million house is still like not super common. So we're not talking about houses being, single family homes being the subject of this tax, which because of the lower thresholds in other cities is more of the case. And this one, we're talking more about commercial buildings. And so when we think about those, that's like office buildings, industrial spaces, but also importantly, multifamily housing. And so part of the controversy on this measure is that it puts the burden on these commercial buildings more than it does, on wealthy people's homes. And the issue there is that like I said, part of commercial real estate is multifamily housing. And we know that if we're raising taxes on the sales of these properties, that is going to affect somewhat builders' decisions to build new multifamily housing in San Francisco. So that isn't exactly the ideal way to structure this tax, but it is the way that San Francisco has gone. And the thinking there was that headed into this economic recession, speculative firms might be trying to kind of swoop in and buy up residential real estate or other commercial property. And this would be a good way to make sure that the city captures some of that activity. We're recommending that people vote yes on this. We are definitely concerned about that aspect of how the tax will affect apartment construction, but we also recognize that the purposes that this money is going to get spent on, which is helping people stay in their homes during the pandemic, and then actually getting a sustainable funding stream for affordable housing is really important. And so on the whole, we think that those good uses of the money kind of outweigh some of the negatives in how it's raised, but definitely would say that, in a perfect world, we might have gone with a different design. But at TechEquity, we're big proponents of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. So we are endorsing this one.
Got it. So not an ideal way to structure it, but worth the sort of trade-off that we have here.
Yeah.
That makes sense. All right, so moving on to Measure K, we've got another one that deals with housing, but in a quite different way. Give us the summary of Measure K.
So Measure K, unfortunately, has to deal with one of the uglier aspects of housing policy in California, which is Article 34 of the state constitution, which kind of sounds like a technical thing, but it's a remnant of a time when it became a requirement that for cities to build new affordable housing, they needed first to put authorization on the ballot so that local voters could approve of a plan to, in the future, think about building affordable housing. And so that remains, unfortunately, today. And so what Measure K is doing is asking San Francisco voters for authorization to eventually build an additional 10,000 units of affordable housing. It's important to note that all this does is it gives authorization for the city to then approve projects in the future. Measure K itself isn't approving any new affordable units. And at TechEquity, obviously, we don't like Article 34, but it is a requirement as the state constitution currently stands. And so we're in support of Measure K in the effort of increasing the amount of affordable housing in San Francisco.
Yeah, it's pretty clear that Article 34 is a really terrible and very discriminatory policy. So why is it still on the books? And didn't Scott Wiener, San Francisco's senator, try to do something about this on the state level to change the Constitution? What happened there? Why wasn't it successful?
Yeah, so unfortunately, as we've seen kind of again and again in recent years. Changing policy in California to make it easy to build more housing is difficult. And yeah, San Francisco State Senator Scott Wiener has tried to get Article 34 taken out of the state constitution, so local governments don't have to ask voters to approve affordable housing. And this is probably less of an issue in a city like San Francisco, but you can certainly imagine a city with, you know, a stronger NIMBY contingent using this to block any affordable housing, and that's just happened. So there are some efforts to get rid of this, but unfortunately they haven't gotten all the way there yet.
Well, that's frustrating. And I guess in the meantime, we'll just have to, you know, approve Measure K and hope that we won't have to have things like this on the ballot in the future.
Yeah, in the meantime, things like, you know, voting yes on Measure K are the best we can do.
Cool. Next one we have is Measure L. This is the last measure, I believe, that TechEquity is taking a position on. Yep. So we'll go after this measure to the ones that we have no position on, and we'll just give a little bit of a summary of each of those. So again, if you have questions about the measures that we've covered up until this point, all the way through Measure L, please go ahead and drop those in the Q&A function so that we can answer the questions that you have about the measures that we're taking positions on and where E&E has policy expertise. So with that, give us the summary of Measure L.
So Measure L. Measure L is also a bit of a controversial measure. And this one would institute a tax on companies whose CEOs make a lot more money than the typical worker in that company. So specifically how this works, it adds on to the gross receipts tax, which is San Francisco's main business tax and part of Measure F that we talked about before. And basically it says, if a company's top managerial employee, which generally speaking we think of as the CEO, makes 100 times or more than the median salary for employees who are based in San Francisco, the company would be subject to an additional tax. And so when that ratio is at 100, the company has to pay an extra 0.1% of their revenue and tax. And it phases up as that ratio gets bigger to a point where if the company's CEO is making 600 times what the median San Francisco worker is in their company, they would pay an additional 0.6% in tax. This is another one that is likely to be pretty volatile, and that's because pay for CEOs can be very volatile. When we're talking about how their pay works, it's a lot less in cash salary that's a little more consistent year to year. And we're talking things about like stock options, equity grants that can have a big value and make them subject to this tax, but aren't consistent year to year. The other issue with this tax and kind of why we're recommending a no vote on this one is the question of what's the proper jurisdiction to do a tax like this. You know, we here at TechEquity think income inequality is like one of the largest problems that we face. And so it seems a little odd maybe at first that we're not supporting this. And one of the big reasons there is because we're a little concerned that for San Francisco to do this alone can create an incentive for companies to move jobs out of San Francisco to kind of game that pay ratio and avoid this tax. And so while we're not necessarily, well, we aren't actually in favor of this Measure L in San Francisco, if a larger governmental body like the state were to consider something like this, there's a good chance that our recommendation would be different.
Got it. So it sounds like there's a concern about the effect this would have on jobs in San Francisco. It also seems like it might be a little bit difficult in some circumstances to even measure what CEO pay is, and it could be ripe for loopholes, which was another reason for opposing this policy. It's just not quite as tight as it should be. So can you talk about how measuring CEO pay might be difficult and what ways in which we might be missing some things with the way the policy is written currently?
Totally. So like I mentioned, when we're talking about these, top pay employees at a company, determining like what their total compensation was in a year is not quite as simple as it is for an average worker, where most of that compensation is salary. That's pretty easy to count. When we're talking about these top paid people, we're getting into harder to value things like equity in the company, and that just opens up the tax to some gaming. And that's another reason that we're a little unsure that this would actually kind of achieve the goals that it's trying to, just because measuring that CEO pay to calculate this ratio is tricky.
Got it. Well, as I said, we're going to move on to the measures that TechEquity doesn't have a position on, and I'm going to stop interrupting with questions and allow you to just whip right through these so that we can leave a bunch of time for audience questions at the end. So with that, take it away.
Absolutely, yes. We'll get through these quick so that we can get to your questions on the ones that we have a little more expertise to help you out with. So first up is Measure B, and this changes up the Public Works Department. Specifically, it carves out street cleaning and sidewalk maintenance from Public Works to a new agency that would be formed. And it also forms a new commission that would oversee both Public Works and this new agency that does street cleaning and sidewalk maintenance. This stems partially from the big corruption scandal that hit the SF Public Works Department back in January, if you can remember that things happened in January. The head of the Public Works Department in San Francisco was arrested by the FBI on fraud charges. And so this is an attempt to kind of increase some oversight of the Public Works Department, which clearly has some issues on that front. Okay, Measure C. This one expands access to city boards. So the city has a number of boards and commissions that advise both the mayor's office, the board of supervisors, and different city agencies on a number of policy topics. Right now, it's a requirement to be a US citizen to serve on one of these boards, but Measure C would get rid of that citizenship requirement so that all San Franciscans, regardless of their immigration status, can participate on these civic bodies. And then Measure D is the first of two police reform measures on San Francisco's ballot this November. So Measure D deals specifically with the San Francisco Sheriff's Department, which is different from the San Francisco Police Department. And that's because San Francisco is both a city and county. And so it has both the San Francisco Police Department, which is the city's police department, but also a county one because. So Measure D would create an oversight committee that can make recommendations to the Sheriff's Department and the Board of Supervisors, but can't force either body to take action on those recommendations. It also would require that any evidence that's uncovered of criminal misconduct by employees of the Sheriff's Department, which includes the sheriff themselves and any deputies, gets referred to the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. Measure E is the other police reform measure on the ballot. And this one deals with the San Francisco Police Department, so the city police department. And what it does is it changes the city's charter to take out a requirement for a minimum number of officers. So right now the city charter says that SFPD has to have at least 1,971 officers. And Measure E would strike that provision, and that would allow the city, if it wanted to in the future, to reduce the number of officers that it employs. So instead of having that minimum count, SFPD would instead be required every 2 years to submit a staffing report to the police commission. Moving on to Measure G. This one touches on youth voting and would change the minimum age for local elections in San Francisco to 16. So 16 and 17-year-olds would be able to vote for the mayor, board of supervisors, these measures, school board, but still not in state and federal races. Measure H touches on the business permitting process in San Francisco, which is notoriously slow. And so Measure H would streamline that process and require city officials to issue a permit within 30 days for businesses that meet existing zoning requirements and are located in the commercial districts of neighborhoods. And the types of businesses that would qualify for this are retail establishments, and then also cafes and some restaurants. And then our last one is Measure J, which is a parcel tax. And a parcel tax is just a property tax that gets applied equally to every property in San Francisco. So this one is a flat $288, and it would fund teacher salaries. In 2018, there was a similar measure that was passed but challenged in courts and is under legal review. This one goes with a 2/3 vote majority to guarantee that those legal challenges couldn't apply to this Measure J. And so if that 2018 measure gets struck down, Measure J would kick in and institute the tax to pay for those teacher salaries. So yeah, that's the 12 measures that are on San Francisco's ballot, and we've got about 15 minutes left and would love to answer more of your questions.
Yeah, so as you can see on the screen, we've got some additional resources for you. Herman, who's been monitoring the chat, will be sending these links and other helpful links to your inbox after the webinar. And so my ask for you is to tell a friend, right? Take all of those amazing resources that you get in your inbox after this webinar and share them with your community, put them on Facebook, put them on Twitter, send them, forward them, whatever you got to do to get the word out to folks about how they should vote and give them the amazing resources that they need to be an informed voter. The second ask that I have for you is to get involved with us by becoming a member of TechEquity. We know that keeping up with what's happening politically can be incredibly challenging, especially because many of us are, mid-career, have young kids, and have a lot going on. And so if you're having trouble keeping track of what's happening in your community on the issues that you care about, a great way for you to get involved is by becoming a member of TechEquity. Ian, Eve, and I are at it every single day, tracking legislation, evaluating ballot measures, meeting with legislators, and making sure that the issues that affect us in our communities on housing and workforce and labor policy have your voice in the mix. So you can become a member of TechEquity for $10 a month or $100 a year, whichever format works better for you. That allows you to vote on our endorsements. So TechEquity members helped to determine what our positions would be on these ballot measures. So if you want to have a voice in our work, if you want to make sure that we can be out there educating voters and advocating for the issues that you care about, become a member of TechEquity today. TechEquityCollaborative.org/membership. Your $10 a month contribution really goes a long way to supporting our work. And the final thing that you can do with us is to take action. So not only casting your ballot, but getting involved with some of our campaigns to make sure that the issues that we care about win the day. We talked a little bit about Proposition 15, which is a statewide measure that will change our corporate property tax system, which is currently unfair and benefits the wealthiest and largest California corporations. We have an opportunity with Prop 15 to reclaim $12 billion in funding every single year for schools and local services like homeless services, construction of affordable housing, and beyond. So some of the things that we talked about today, needing a sustainable funding stream, Prop 15 can be the solution for some of those things. So if you want to make sure that Prop 15 passed, we have phone banks every single Wednesday. I'd highly encourage you to get involved and volunteer with us. So with that, we're going to jump into Q&A. And our first question comes from Rachel, who's asking about Proposition F. They want to know how small businesses are defined and businesses hit hardest by the pandemic. Seems like a little bit of a squishy term. So help us to understand how Prop F is really making sure that businesses that are struggling right now are not going to be affected.
I'm muted. Uh, small businesses are defined based on the amount of sales that they receive. And I don't, off the top of my head, have the exact figure, but I know it's in the low single millions of dollars. So I think it's somewhere around like $1 to $2 million and below are defined as small businesses. And then for the other part about giving businesses that have been hit hard by the pandemic a break on some of these tax increases, that's based on the change in the business's revenue relative to a year ago. And again, I'm not sure the exact threshold for the amount of that decrease, but basically it's comparing their 2021 revenue to their 2019 revenue. And if it's decreased by a certain percentage or more, that increase gets delayed for them.
That's super helpful. I should also mention that if you want more nitty-gritty details about Prop F or any of these other propositions, you can check out our voter guide, which will come out next week in our newsletter. And E&E also authors a really amazing blog series on our blog that dives into our propositions that we're taking a position on as well. So there's a ton more detailed information about sort of the arguments and who's supporting it and all that sort of stuff on our website as well. So highly encourage you all to check that out if you want to go even a level further of depth than we're able to cover in an hour-long webinar. The next question I have is coming from Catherine, who asks, what would be the average property tax increase for Proposition A, the bond measure?
So based on the city's reporting, it's rather small, and it seems to be one that would be it paid with like a modest tax increase. Again, I don't have that exact number, but I did kind of note that it didn't seem too large. And the measure would allow landlords to pass through half of that cost to tenants. But again, it seemed like that would be a pretty small amount of money, and certainly not a reason to kind of outweigh the good uses that would be used with that bond revenue.
Thanks. We have another question from Michelle about Measure I. Michelle says there's concern that a much higher volume of under $10 million multimillionaire homeowners would be let off the hook completely by Measure I. And so this means that a lot of the transactions that take place will be made by developers of apartment buildings and affordable type of housing. I'm not sure where this number is coming from because Michelle isn't providing us a source, but she says that economists estimate that Measure I will result in fewer apartments being constructed per year, about 20%. And Michelle wants to understand why we should vote for something that will tax the wrong people, potentially reduce housing. It kind of seems like it might not be an appropriate trade-off and could backfire. So she's asking for more information about how the sort of good will outweigh the bad with this measure.
I mean, yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, it's one that doesn't have a perfectly sharp, kind of clear answer, kind of one way or the other on this. I definitely agree with you, Michelle, that it lets off people who have homes that are worth between $2 and $10 million, which happens to include the supervisor who wrote this measure, which generally speaking is not a great way to make policy. That being said, it's not just apartments that this is going to hit. It would also, tax commercial property sales that aren't multifamily housing. And that's a pretty progressive way to raise revenue. As to that 20% fewer apartments constructed every year in San Francisco, I know that was in SFUMB's ballot guide. I didn't see a hard source for that in there, and that number seems implausibly large to me. I definitely, agree that that it would have some kind of negative effect on production in the city. I have a hard time believing that it would knock down the number of apartments being built by 20% though. And so then really when it comes down to, this is the measure that we have on the ballot. Do we vote yes or no on it? It's really trying to weigh some of these, not exactly perfect bits against each other. And where we came down on this was just, San Francisco, again, as a city, is limited in the ways that it can raise money. And there's a clear need for funding to help fight evictions as a result of the pandemic and to pay to build affordable housing. And so, we are comfortable with making that trade-off of maybe not the most well-targeted tax to raise money for those purposes. But I certainly could understand how different groups, different voters, or maybe even some of you who are watching today would come to a different conclusion on that. And I think that's also valid.
Thanks for giving us some nuance with that one, because it is a little bit of a tricky one, but super helpful to air out the details. Well, it's 12:56. We have a few more minutes. So for our audience, if you had a question that you didn't get a chance to throw out there yet, now is your moment. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions before we conclude our webinar today. So please take a moment, type that question out in the chat, and we'd love to answer it.
Yeah, I love answering these questions, so feel free to give me more.
Thanks for the feedback, Michelle. She said thanks for the answer. So cool. Well, I'm seeing no additional questions. Oh, I've got one more, which is sort of an imaginative question, since we talked about how Measure I is a little bit imperfect. We've got a question, which is, what would your dream legislation be if we can author and if we can pass anything? I guess that's sort of a fun way to close things out. So it's time for you to play If I Were Queen, Eve. What would you pass?
I would break down the borders of San Francisco, and this would be kind of part of a larger package of regional consolidation in the Bay Area, especially with regard to housing. One of the big challenges that we face is that each individual city has this incentive to not put their best effort out there at building more housing. That problem gets a little bit lower if there aren't as many cities and it's not as fragmented. So if I could wave a magic wand, which I don't have, but that would be great, and I had to use it to change a law in San Francisco, I would make San Francisco bigger.
Maybe go for a little bit of a boroughs type of situation, where Oakland is a borough and San Francisco is a borough and Emeryville is a borough, and everybody has to work
like
together.
That. Yeah, we can't let San Francisco take over the East Bay. I don't support that, but I think being a little bit more co-equal. Hey, I got the magic wand, so why not?
Well, that's a fun one and a super interesting answer. So a great way to close out our webinar for today. I hope everyone found value in spending an hour with us to dive into these measures. Your vote is really important, especially on a local level, where you have so much sway in what happens in these elections. Again, I'll make one more appeal for you to join us as a member of TechEquity. Eve spends hours upon hours of research to produce this type of content. In fact, it's literally their entire quarter of work is spent on this. So if you value that type of content, if you think the information that we're putting out through our voter guides, through our blog posts, and through this webinar series are helpful, we ask that you chip in to support the development of this type of work. Become a member of TechEquity today. $10 a month or $100 a year helps us get the funding that we need to do this type of work. So with that, I thank everyone for spending time with us, and thank you for being a voter and trying to be an informed voter. And we'll see you on the next webinar with your East Bay friends next week. So thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.